Hello, Katie again. We are reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief by Frances Weller, forward by Michael Lerner. Chapter 1. An Apprenticeship with Sorrow. Grief dares us to love once more. Terry Tempest Williams. This is a book about grief, about its many moods and movements, shapes and textures. It is about how sorrow carves riverbeds in our soul, deepening us as it flows in and out of our lives. There is something familiar about the rising and falling of loss, how it takes us below the surface of our lives and works on us in some alchemical way. We are remade in times of grief, broken apart and reassembled. It is hard, painful, and unbidden work. No one goes in search of loss. Rather, it finds us and reminds us of the temporary gift we have been given. These few sweet breaths we call life. I'm not sure how or when I began my apprenticeship with sorrow. I do know that it was my gateway back into the breathing and animate world. It was through the dark waters of grief that I came to touch my unlived life, by at last unleashing tears I had never shed for the losses in my world. Grief led me back into a world that was vivid and radiant. There is some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive. Through this, I have come to have a lasting faith in grief. This book is also about restoring the soul of the world. Bringing soul back to the world means perceiving the world through a deepened imagination, one that is capable of experiencing our intimacy with the surrounding world, of finches and dragonflies, creeks and woodlands, neighborhoods and friends. Everything possesses soul. It is our myopia, our one-dimensional attention to things human, that leads us to see the world as an object, something to be controlled, manipulated, and consumed. The earth is a revelation, offering itself to us daily in an astonishing array of beauty and suffering. What is required of us is living with a level of openness and vulnerability to the joys and sorrows of the world. Taking in the beauty of the land as well as the great rips and tears in her skin require a psyche attuned to the living world and one engaged in the ongoing conversation with all things. Soul returns to the world when we attend to the rhythms of nature, when we nourish our friendships with time and attention, and in our daily participation with repairing the world. How well we do that will determine the fate of our communities and the planet. For more than 30 years, I have worked with individuals in my practice as a psychotherapist and in workshop settings. The one emotion that has touched everyone is grief. It may be the grief we finally allow ourselves to feel for the life we did not choose. It may be our sorrow for losses that happened early in our life, losses that we were unprepared to grieve. It may be for relationships that fell apart, friendships that have vanished, times of violation and abandonment, or for the suffering we feel for our ravished earth. When the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded and began spilling oil in the spring of 2010, we were confronted with a grief we could barely comprehend. The daily images of oil-soaked pelicans, turtles, dolphins, and other sea creatures crashed into our awareness in ways we could not deny. For months we watched as the oil gushed from the leak 5,000 feet below the surface into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, onto the white sandy beaches, and into the bayous. And we shared a common sorrow, a grief that washed into our souls, where there was a feeling that something had been irrevocably changed by this event. The scientists reported that the spill effects might linger for years, perhaps changing the life of the Gulf forever. We looked on in shock and disbelief. Our hearts were broken. I often woke in the middle of the night during that time, sensing the dying creatures and weeping for them. It was not something over there that was happening. It was here in my body, in my heart. It was as if a part of me was being devastated by the oil, suffocated and poisoned by the toxins as they spewed into the water. Whatever physical distance there was between me and the Gulf, it made no difference. I experienced it immediately in my soul, and I know this was true for many others as well. It wasn't long after the capping of the well on July 15th that our attention slowly drifted away from the Gulf. We were assured that everything was returning to normal and the waters were fine and we would soon be able to eat the shrimp and fish again. We slowly slipped back into denial, away from the frightening truth that the oil was still there, plumes of oil deep beneath the surface, affecting the entire food chain from plankton to whales. Television and radio coverage quickly dried up, except for those living near the disaster. The animals, birds, sea life, and humans. Our capacity for distraction soon outweighed our capacity for attention and grief. I was reminded of a line from the German poet Rilke. I think that's how you say his name. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this massive darkness makes me small. He wrote that line in 1904. Our knowledge of grief has not grown much since then, and consequently this darkness makes us small. How do we learn to carry our grief and not collapse or turn away in denial? How do we come to see grief as vital and necessary and not something only to be endured? To achieve this shift requires a revisioning of grief, not as an event in our lives, a period of mourning, but as an ongoing conversation that accompanies us throughout our life. Grief and loss are with us continually, shaping our walk through life and in some real ways determining how fully we engage our lives. This shift in perspective invites us into a prolonged period of learning the ways and styles of grief. In essence, we are asked to take up an apprenticeship with sorrow. An apprenticeship with sorrow leads us to the heart of loss. Soul invites us repeatedly to take up this endeavor and be shaped by its multiple demands. An apprenticeship with sorrow requires a hands-on encounter in which we are invited to work with the materials of grief, its leaden weight, and the particular demands of melancholy. When we feel it already, just in these few sentences, that this apprenticeship leads us below ground into the hallway of shadows and forgotten ancestors. Here we find the scattered shards of unattended grief, the pieces of unwept loss, and the shavings of old wounds swept into the corner. An apprenticeship with sorrow invites us to learn the rites of grief and to practice a reverence of approach. An Irish poet-philosopher, John O'Donohue, suggests as he writes, "What you encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree on the quality of your approach. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. How we approach our sorrows profoundly affects what comes to us in return. We often hold grief at a distance, hoping to avoid our entanglement with this challenging emotion. This leads to our feeling detached, disconnected, and cold. At other times, there is no space between us and the grief we are feeling. We are then swept up in the tidal surge of sorrow and often feel as though we are drowning. An approach of reverence offers us the chance to learn a more skillful pattern of relating with grief. When we come to our grief with reverence, we find ourselves in right relationship with sorrow, neither too far away nor too close. We have entered into an ongoing conversation with this difficult holy visitor. Learning we can be with our grief, holding it softly and warmly, is the first task of our apprenticeship. Approaching sorrow, however, requires enormous psychic strength. For us to tolerate the rigors of engaging the images, emotions, memories, and dreams that arrive in times of grief, we need to fortify our interior ground. This is done through developing a practice that we sustain over time. Any form will do: writing, dancing, meditation, prayer, or something else, as long as we continue to show up and maintain our effort. A practice offers ballast, something to help us hold steady in difficult times. This deepens our capacity to hold the vulnerable emotions surrounding loss without being overwhelmed by them. Grief work is not passive. It implies an ongoing practice of deepening, attending, and listening. It is an act of devotion rooted in love and compassion. See the resources at the end of this book for more on developing the practice of compassion. Highly recommend. One of the most essential skills we need to develop in our apprenticeship is our ability to stay present in our adult selves when grief arises. I have often witnessed, both in my private practice and in workshop settings, individuals regressing into a childlike state when feelings of grief emerge. They suddenly feel panicked, overwhelmed, hopeless, alone, and ashamed. They slide into another mode of being when sorrow comes near, one in which their perspectives, feelings, and behavior radically change. It is important to help them restore a connection with their adult selves, or they risk slipping further into their dissociated states and possibly getting lost there for a prolonged time. The childlike state is what Jung calls a complex. Complexes are fragmentary bundles of concentrated emotional energy formed when we were confronted with an experience too intense for us to successfully digest. In these moments, the psyche splinters off the difficult material and creates an autonomous, semi-contained bundle to hold the highly charged material. It is stunning and fortunate that the psyche is able to do this. In these volatile times, we are spared the full weight of the encounter and allowed to retain some measure of control. We only have to think of anyone confronted with the overwhelming violence of war zones, a tornado ripping through a community, destroying everything in its path, or the devastation of rape or molestation. Complexes form as a consequence of trauma and are a major part of the experience in post-traumatic stress disorder. Our psyches dissociate, splitting off the offending material from consciousness for the time being. For many of us, our experiences of loss were not adequately contained by those around us. We were not offered an adequate level of what trauma therapists call attunement to the emotional states that envelop us. Attunement is a particular quality of attention, wedded with affection, offered by someone we love and trust. This deep attention is what enables us to make painful experiences tolerable. We feel held and comforted, reassured and safe. The failure to provide a safe and nurturing space in times of loss and grief can precipitate the formation of a complex. When the outer containment field of the parent or community is missing or too porous, the psyche will split off the overwhelming emotions, temporarily sparing us from direct exposure. The story, however, does not end there. Complexes return again and again and seem to carry the intention of being reabsorbed back into consciousness. When the complex appears, we are taken out of the present moment and situated back into our histories at the point of the trauma. What had been severed for the sake of our preservation must now be rejoined for the sake of our healing. In other words, the emotional material that was absorbed into the complex must ultimately be faced and reconciled. Until we do, the complex will interfere with the intentions of the will and disturb the conscious performance. Jung's words help us see the necessity of confronting our circumstances and doing the hard, painful work of reconciling the complex. See the resources at the end of the book for more on working with the complex. Establishing a relationship with grief, developing practices that keep us steady in times of distress, and staying present in our adult selves are among the central tasks in our apprenticeship with sorrow. This is the hard work of maturation. In the traditional language of apprenticeship, this would be called achieving mastery. In the language of the soul, this is the work of becoming an elder. An elder is able to touch grief deftly and is able to craft sorrow into something nourishing for the community. Teacher and grief specialist Stephen Jenkinson says, "Hold your sorrow to a degree of eloquence, whereby everyone around you will feel fed by your efforts to do so." Becoming skillful at digesting our grief makes us a source of reassurance and stability for the wider community. Every mature culture has guided its people to this apprenticeship with grief. Underlying this education is an acknowledgement of our spiritual indebtedness to the cosmos for all we are given to sustain us day to day. These cultures honor this truth and have based their ritual life and teachings around it. Gestures of humility and purification, such as sweat lodges and initiation rites, acknowledge that we live in a sacramental cosmos and that life feeds on life. We cannot escape this truth, and the appropriate response to it is a ripened melancholy combined with rituals of gratitude. The Mayan people say we all carry a deep spiritual debt for what we are given, which we can never fully repay. They say it is important that we do our best to honor this debt with our eloquence and displays of ritual beauty. Our culture has, by and large, failed to honor this debt, and the results are precisely what we see: a world rapidly being emptied by a never-ending hunger for more. Grief work is soul work. It requires courage to face the world as it is and not turn away, to not burrow into a hole of comfort and anesthetization. Grief deepens our connection with soul, taking us into territories of vulnerability, exposing the truth of our need for others in times of loss and suffering. I have been moved on many occasions when someone risked revealing what was present in his or her heart, raw, naked expression of sorrow. Grief also reveals the undeniable reality of our bond with the world. Whatever fiction we carry that allows us to feel separate and insulated, the overwhelming suffering we feel during events such as the Gulf Coast oil spill and the World Trade Center tragedy, or any violation of our local community or the land we love, reminds us of our intimate connections. It is grief that offers us a way to respond to situations such as these. It is grief that moves us in the direction of contact toward the helping hands and embrace of others. We need grief in order to heal these traumas and make sense of the world turned upside down. Remembering the wisdom of grief allows us to cultivate faith and a deeper pulse within the soul. It is the via negativa, the road through the depths, that leads to what mythologist Michael Meade calls dark wisdom. Through this, we are able to lean into the world and trust the deeper currents that move through all things. Where there is sorrow, wrote Oscar Wilde, there is holy ground. This book is a meditation on the sacred ground of grief and the ways it enables us to walk in this world with its realities of loss and death, how it shapes us and breaks us open to depths of soul we could not imagine. Grief offers a wild alchemy that transmutes suffering into fertile ground. We are made real and tangible by the experience of sorrow, as it adds substance and weight to our world. Beyond the crazed hunger in our culture to be exceptional, loss and sorrow wear away whatever masks we attempt to present to the world. Like the massive stone carvings in the jungles of Central America that now lie broken down on the forest floor, the monuments we erect to our own importance collapse. We are stripped of excess and revealed as humans in our time of grief. Grief ripens us, pulls up from the depths of our soul what is most authentic in our beings. In truth, without some familiarity with sorrow, we do not mature as men and women, or people. It is the broken heart, the part that knows sorrow, that is capable of genuine love. The heart familiar with loss is able to recognize a still deeper grief, a sadness at the very heart of things, that binds us with the world. Without this awareness and willingness to be shaped by life, we remain caught in the adolescent strategies of avoidance and heroic striving. I am an advocate for grief. I see the many ways it gifts us. While it is difficult to embrace grief and be moved by its muscular demands, without it we would not know the heartening qualities of compassion. While it is difficult to embrace grief and be moved by its muscular demands, without it, we would not know the heartening quality of compassion, could not experience the full breadth of love, the surprise of joy, we could not celebrate the sheer beauty of the world. Grief fosters each of these capabilities, deepening them by bringing gravity to the moment. Grief is the dark color that adds depth to the canvas, providing contrast and texture. Without these tones, our lives would be flat and uninteresting. This necessary encounter, in turn, enables these vital qualities to hold us in times of loss and sorrow. I am not suggesting that we live a life preoccupied with sorrow. I am saying that our refusal to welcome the sorrows that come to us, our inability to move through these experiences with true presence and conscious awareness, condemns us to a life shadowed by grief. Welcoming everything that comes to us is the challenge. This is the secret to being fully alive. I see this work as soul activism, a form of deep resistance to the disconnected way in which our society has conditioned us to live. Grief is subversive, undermining our society's quiet agreement that we will behave and be in control of our emotions. It is an act of protest that declares our refusal to live numb and small. There is something feral about grief, something essentially outside the ordained and sanctioned behaviors of our culture. Because of that, grief is necessary to the vitality of the soul. Contrary to our fears, grief is suffused with life force. It is riddled with energy, an acknowledgement of the erotic coupling with another soul, whether human, animal, plant, or ecosystem. It is not a state of deadness or emotional flatness. Grief is alive, wild, untamed. It cannot be domesticated. It resists the demands to remain passive and still. We move in jangled, unsettled, and riotous ways when our grief takes hold of us. It is truly an emotion that rises from soul. What has become clear to me is the powerful role grief plays in enabling us to face what is taking place in our lives, our communities, our ecologies, families, and culture. Through our ability to acknowledge the layers of loss, we can truly discover our capacity to respond, to protect, and to restore what has been damaged. Grief registers the sorrows that befall everything that matters deeply to our souls. Our hearts are kept flexible, fluid, and open to the world through this closeness with loss. Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to pause there before we move on to chapter 2. Thanks for joining me. See you again soon. Bye.